Thank you very much, Bruce, and thank you for allowing me and Chauncy the time here to kind of talk about things that we've been thinking about and discussing, and like you said, discussing not only amongst ourselves but with other SUs and cross-regionally, with others from Western, Central, or Western, Southern, and Eastern regions. So definitely these, like I always say, a good SU steals a lot of things from other SUs and ideas and has discussions, and a lot of this is not just me and Chauncy. It's discussions that have gone on for the past 2 or 3 years. We will have a few poll everywhere slides. This won't be a totally interactive type of presentation, but for when we do get to the poll questions, there's the information on how to participate. So either a web page or text message, either should work for this presentation. This presentation kind of started as me and Chauncy just kind of wanting to talk about a lot of pet peeves that we see within AFDs. So basically it kind of started with, we just want to kind of air our grievances and talk about things that we see in AFDs, but I think it's turned into much more than that. So we're really excited to kind of talk about where we feel AFD should be headed in the future, kind of what the modernized AFD should look like. So we do have a current directive, and I think the current directive highlights a lot of what we want to do within the AFD. It being a semi-technical product that's primarily used as a means to explain the scientific rationale behind a forecast. Maybe it's not so much used for coordination and collaboration anymore, but that last sentence in the purpose of the AFD there, that's in our directives, to provide insight, or the forecast insight provided in the AFD is beyond that which can be found in other NWS products. And I think that to me is one of the more important lines that's in our directive. The AFD, looking at that sentence, to me basically is saying the AFD is a very important DSS tool that we have to communicate forecast information. But with that said, some questions that I think that we're all wrestling with, should we modernize the AFD? If the answer to that is yes, how should we modernize the AFD? And what is kind of that modernized purpose of the AFD? And there's a great document that was shared with all of Central Region that I think kind of lays the foundation to try to answer those questions and gives a purpose and a direction that the agency should be headed in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Hopefully you've all had a chance to kind of read through that vision for the modernized forecast operations concept. But what I want to do over the next 5 to 10 minutes is kind of tie the information from that document into why we feel and how we feel the AFD should look in the future. Some things to think about when writing AFDs. So the first poll everywhere question, just so we have an understanding of your understanding of that document, just kind of wondering, what is your understanding of that document? Have you read it yet? If you haven't read it yet, it's okay. That's fine. We'll kind of cover some of the concepts in there. Maybe you've read it but don't totally understand all the concepts. That would be B. And then, if you've read it multiple times, like this is a document that I had to read 10, 15, 20 times just to start to kind of get an understanding of where, where we should be headed as an agency over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. We got 12 results in. I'll kind of show the results here, and well, that's a great thing that everybody on this call at least has read it a couple times. So I think that's a great step forward. So why would we want to message probabilistically within the AFD? And a lot of the screenshots are going to be from that document here, kind of tying the concepts in that document to some of the concepts that we want to talk about with where we feel the AFD should be headed. So why would we want to message probabilistic within the AFD? So kind of a goal, I think, of where we want to be headed is to revolutionize our ability to protect life and property. As meteorologists, we want to provide useful information, not just good forecasts. And the key to that, I think, is communication. The key is for that, you want to get the forecast right, but the forecast ends in the mind of the user, right? If the user doesn't understand the forecast, or if the user is making poor decisions based on the forecast, it's not really a useful or a good forecast. So we have to kind of think about retooling our operations to produce actionable information. And the way forward to do that, what social science research is telling us is we need to fully leverage probabilistic information, focus on the things that humans do well, embrace change, and really work with our partners to learn what questions they need answers to. And then by doing that, I think we're going to provide and raise our level of service kind of to that next level. Always looking to improve, always looking to provide the best information to our customers and our partners. So why would we want to go there? There was a systematic literature review commissioned by the Weather Service at Oklahoma University, and from that systematic literature review, they came up with, I think it was 12 or 13 practical recommendations. So if you haven't seen this website listed here yet, I strongly recommend to go to that website, look at those practical recommendations that came out of that systematic literature review. And I think this is really the basis, or the base, that foundation of why we want to go to kind of where we feel we should be headed to. And basically the summary is users, whether it's partners or the public, they understand the forecast and make better decisions given clear probabilistic information. And the key to that is that communication is just as important as accuracy. And if you think about the AFD, that's our vehicle, that's kind of our main vehicle to communicate with everybody that is within our forecast area, or everybody that is making decisions based on our forecast. And that to me is kind of the key, is we need to start building relationships, right? But we need to take baby steps of our goals for the future, and to take those baby steps to start communicating the right way within our AFDs, I think is kind of that step of how we can learn to communicate, and how we can really learn to communicate the right way. So just want to highlight a few of the practical recommendations that came out of that systematic literature review. The first one is to use probability information in lieu of deterministic information. So instead of saying these storms will cause heavy downpours and flooding, say there's an extremely high 90% chance that these storms will cause heavy downpours and flooding. People are going to make better decisions and have a higher trust in the information, and display a greater understanding of the forecast information when shown a probabilistic forecast instead of a deterministic one. Another practical recommendation that came out of that is to include numeric translations next to words or phrases that indicate probability information. So we have all these words of estimated probability that we use, but these words of estimated probability can be interpreted differently by different people. And this is just an example, I apologize, I forgot to put the reference here for this example here, but you can see that, if you tell somebody there's a chance for thunderstorms, that can be interpreted in a number of different ways. And there's even a few people that are going to think there's an 80 or 90, that there's a really good chance for thunderstorms to occur, even though we may mean 30%. Other people are going to interpret that differently. So not to just use words of estimated probability, but to also put a number next to that word of estimated probability. And kind of the last practical recommendation I wanted to highlight, and these all kind of, I think, tie into how we should be thinking when we're communicating through the AFD, is really to pay attention to the audience when using probability information. Most people are going to be able to grasp basic probability information, but not all people are numerate. Not all people have a lot of experience. So as forecasters, through our AFD, for this talk of what we're talking about, we play a critical role in really setting the context for communicating probability information through the use of the language that we're using. I don't know how many of you have seen the show Designated Survivor. Great show, I loved it, but there was a phrase in one of the episodes of Designated Survivor that said, there are no certainties, there are only outcomes. And I think that really rings true with every forecast that we're trying to develop a message for. there's always going to be at least some uncertainty. Now, we may be able to eliminate all other potential outcomes, and one potential outcome has a really, really high chance, 90, 95% chance of happening. Maybe then we only want to communicate that one potential outcome. But if there are especially high impact, low probability type situations, we have to try to think probabilistically and message those potential outcomes via our AFD. So, I think that's another reason for the direction of wanting to modernize our AFD. So what's the path forward? How do we get there? This is kind of the target I think that we want to be headed toward in the next 5 years. And in the document, there's another, it's got number 2 there in the upper left. That kind of shows that next step of where we're headed. I'm not going to share that here because I believe the first step is really communicating probabilistically through the AFD, kind of in this introduce and evaluate. Like I said, taking baby steps toward our end goal of where we want to be. I think another thing we have to think about is it's not really easy to think probabilistically. As humans, it's human nature to really think deterministically. We've been trained in school, we've been trained professionally to rush through our forecast process to determine what the most likely outcome is. And it's really self-awareness and thinking about it every day, really trying to critically think that maybe we are tending more deterministically, and to really have to adjust that forecaster mindset to think probabilistically. So as an example, one thing I try to tell our forecasters here mostly every day is try not to think what is the most likely outcome at each location, but instead try to think, is predictability high enough to message only the most likely outcome at each location. So the role of the future meteorologist obviously is changing. We've talked about this over the past years, and the time we spend on different tasks is going to have to change as we move forward. And with that in mind, one thing that I really wanted to talk about is that, what's that interaction between the human and technology? In the past, the machine and the human have been pretty separate, right? But, thinking about where we want to be headed, thinking about where we want to spend time in the forecast process, the human is going to have to be married with the machine. We have to really think about what the human does best versus what the machine does best, right? So I've heard that NBM is a teenager right now, but in 5, 10, 15 years, the NBM is going to be grown up, and there's not going to be very many opportunities to improve upon its guidance. We're going to have nearly flawless statistical guidance, and we have to figure out where the human, what's the human's role within the forecast process. And to me, something only humans can provide is understanding of both the atmosphere and human behavior. Another thing that humans do really, really well is, or that humans can do that I don't think machines can do, is to explain the uncertainty, right? A machine can tell you that there is uncertainty, but to be able to give the partner that information that they need to use to make good decisions, to explain the uncertainty, to explain what may lead to this potential outcome, what may lead to another potential outcome, is really something that the human is going to be able to do very, very well. So technology is really going to help for the quality aspect of what makes a good forecast, but it's really going to be up to the human to do the consistency and the value part of what makes a good forecast. Again, weather forecasts possess no intrinsic value. They only acquire value through their ability to influence the decisions made by users of the forecast. And if you think about it, that's where the AFD can really be a powerful DSS tool. I think we have to have a consistent forecast process. There's a foundational training team that was just put together by Central Region that's going to cover the forecast process, I think, how to use deterministic and probabilistic guidance, how to assess predictability. But those are kind of tied to the AFD, right? So how we write the AFD probably should follow our forecast process. Again, I'm not going to cover this. We're not going to cover this in too much depth on this presentation because there's training coming in the future. But I just wanted to kind of mention that the process that we use within our forecast to not only assess predictability, but to develop our message needs to be consistent. And I think just one quick word on the forecast process, identifying targets of opportunity is a really important part of that. And I think, how can we perform the analysis and assessment part of our forecast, part of that forecast process that you saw in the previous slide. And I think it's utilizing both deterministic and probabilistic guidance, but understanding that we need time to develop our message, that the message development occurs throughout our entire forecast process. And then I think if we think about the forecast process as one, identifying messaging opportunities, and then assessing predictability and impacts for each of those messaging opportunities, I think lays out a more consistent type forecast process for everybody to go through. Interacting with our partners and our customers is going to be a really important part of the modernized operations cycle. Again, this is not really a debrief on that document, but I did want to include this slide just to kind of give a flavor of the modernized operations cycle. So you think you know what you want, right? But is it really the best way? I think a lot of our partners are always telling us that they want, what's your best guess? Give us your best guess. But we have to realize that when we give them a deterministic forecast, if we message deterministically through our AFD, that might not be the best information to give them for them to be able to make the best, most informed decision. So we have to kind of realize that it's kind of one of our jobs and duties and responsibilities as well to train our partners, to make them comfortable with probabilistic information, and moving forward, not taking like what they want with a, taking what they want kind of with a grain of salt, right? And realizing that there may be better information where they can make better decisions. So IDSS of the future, I think, kind of laid out in that document is we need to go deep with each partner to understand exactly what they need to provide tailored product, during an event, and we need to follow up with them. Spot forecasts or whatever lose a lot of their utility without direct relationships between the two parties that facilitate communication before, during, and after issuances. Again, that's something for the future. That's something we need to think about as an end goal. But I think the AFD is going to be one of those vehicles to allow us to take those baby steps to get to that goal. So what does it mean to message probabilistically with an AFD? Within an AFD, I think the AFD has to be looked at as a DSS tool. This is the kind of the one tool that really allows the human, right? What does the human do really, really well? Where does the human fit within that forecast process? Allows the human to explain the uncertainty. There's not a lot of other, and if you go back to our directive, there's not a lot of other products that really allow us to explain the uncertainty the way that an AFD does. And really, I think the AFD should kind of mirror our forecast process, right? So these are some of the questions I think that we need to try to answer in our AFD while we're writing our AFD, while we're trying to communicate probabilistically through our AFD. So what are the messaging targets of opportunity for this forecast period? We're scientists, right? We have to keep science within our messaging, within the forecast process. What's the general synoptic pattern for this period? What's your confidence in that pattern, and what's the reasoning behind your confidence in that pattern? And then for each messaging target of opportunity, what are the anticipated impacts, right? So every AFD should probably have the word impact in it, because that's kind of what people are concerned about. How is that weather going to impact me? If precipitation is expected, what's the forcing mechanism responsible for that QPF that the model is producing, right? And how does that affect the predictability horizon? And then what are the potential outcomes? And then what are the key features that's going to lead to each potential outcome? And what's the probability for each potential outcome? Again, it's not just spewing numbers out, right? It's talking probabilistically about potential outcomes and what people should be prepared for. And then what's the probability of each of those outcomes that people should be prepared for? So this is kind of, after some conversations between me and Chauncy, kind of a sample AFD structure that we came up with. Central region, there's been a lot of talk about key messages. Maybe we should put key messages within our AFDs. And I think that flows very well with the forecast process, right? So that first step of a forecast process should be identifying messaging opportunities, and to put those messaging opportunities at the front of an AFD, I think is just a great idea. And then within the discussion part, whether you break it up into short or long term or just have one big discussion, go through your forecast process and try to lay it out and answer the questions. What are the current conditions? What's the expected synoptic pattern? And then confidence in that synoptic pattern. Why are you not confident? And then to talk about each of those messaging opportunities a little more in depth. One other thing I'll say about this AFD structure, something that the Northern Plains offices do, and I know a few other offices do as well, is we put an update section in our AFD every 3 hours. Even if no changes are expected to the forecast, our media tells us that those updates are important, and they don't want to be guessing whether or not a forecast is going to be updated, or guessing whether or not the forecast is on track, or guessing whether or not there's going to be impacts that are changing. Even an update to say, hey, here's the current conditions, things are on track, is really, really important, at least for our media and the feedback that we get from them. So I think that's the end of my section. I'm going to hand it over to Chauncy, and he's going to go over kind of a lot of the ins and outs and do's and don'ts and things of that nature as they refer to the AFD. So Chauncy, take it away.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Tommy. If Tommy hasn't convinced you yet that the AFD is important, and I'm pretty sure he has, you might ask yourself, so who reads the AFD? Why else does this matter? And, I think many of you realize, and I know in our offices, in talking with our partners and things like that, we realize lots of different folks read the AFD and they use it as their go-to. And that's why I really like to think of the AFD as sort of the insider information kind of thing. You can go to the point and click and get the forecast. They can look at our watches and our warnings and things like that. When they really want to know what that sort of insider information is, and I think that's why people get excited to go to the AFD, is to see what's in the thought process of our heads as forecasters. They go to this product. So I steal a quote there from my brother. Yes, Garrett is my brother, but he's a golf course superintendent. He's a little more on the weather savvy side, but he told me a few years ago, without me asking, that when he really wants to know what the real forecast is, when he's making decisions that matter for money, that matter for staffing and things like that, he goes to the forecast discussion. So he uses our webpage and things like that. And as we were preparing this presentation, I asked him again. He said, "Yep, that's still absolutely true." He goes to the AFD when he really wants to know what's the real forecast is. And when he says the real forecast, he says that we mention things in there that doesn't show up in the deterministic forecast, things he can plan around. So again, AFD, important information. I also want to add, as broadcast media there, force multipliers, right? Several times within the last month, as the Northern Plains have been impacted by some of these big blizzards and things like that, I've seen our broadcast media partners actually pull out sections of our AFD, including at times the technical details, and sharing them on their social media posts, saying, here's directly from the Weather Service, here's what they're thinking. A lot of times it's outcome-based kind of stuff when we're dealing with P-type issues and things like that. It gets good place. Not only are they using them internally, but they're sharing them externally too. It's a force multiplier. So if we go ahead and go to the next slide, one thing that our office has done is actually be able to track a little bit what our AFD page views are. So if you go to the text product page on our webpage where the AFD biz product would be, and through last summer into last fall, and I believe this has been consistent even more recently, we get about 190 page views a day on our AFD, which might not seem like a ton, but when you consider the fact that, yes, we're a more rural office, and this is going to be a product that not everybody uses, right? That's actually pretty good, and it's consistent. And there's peak times twice a day. People are waking up checking the forecast. People are checking the forecast late in the day. Yes, I am, by the way, an AFD user myself, but I don't actually pull our AFD from this webpage, so I'm not skewing our results, by the way. You can also see that there's a large peak in our page views last October, right in the middle of this graph. That was right ahead of a widespread rain in our first snow event, where we had almost 800 views one day, right ahead of that event. So again, as the weather gets more active, more folks are using the AFD, even from the general public side. And again, our broadcast media doesn't necessarily get them this way either. I know one of our main chief meteorologists, our main stations here in Bismarck, they actually auto print the AFD every time it gets sent, day in, day night, and they have for years and years and years. And of course, pilots, if we go to the next slide, and the aviation community do as well. This is some stats that I came across recently again, and the Aviation Weather Center, of course, has a page that links to the AFD section of our AFDs. And in 2019 alone, they had almost 5 million page views. And there's 10 minutes on average spent on this page. So again, People are going there, they're reading the aviation AFD, and 78% of the users that the AWC actually surveyed used the page at least some, and a lot of them used it more than some. So again, there's a spectrum of users here where we can really share a lot of information that we can't share elsewhere. So historically, we spent a lot of times trying to get the grid number just right? Well, that's a deterministic forecast. And as Tommy just showed, all of these folks are making better decisions when they have an uncertainty, probabilistically based driven product. What's the best easy way for us to do that and really communicate a lot of things to all of them? Of course, it's through the AFD. So we've made the case. Now let's start getting into some tips and tricks and maybe some ideas that you can use right out of the gate for shaping a probabilistic type AFD writing style. So again, it's that inside scoop. I oftentimes go back to, what am I going to put in here that's not found elsewhere? That's what really drives a lot of folks to read the AFD, and this is where we can communicate stuff that's really hard to communicate elsewhere. And yes, include technical details. It builds trust. Even if folks don't understand it, it builds trust with them that we know what we're doing and that our forecast as a result is more trustworthy. Plus, on the side, it kind of lets you be a scientist. We talk a lot about in the modernized forecast process, where is the science, right? Here's one place where you not only get to still be a scientist, you get to share that too, which is pretty cool stuff. So as you write, ask yourself, what would I want to read? So I am not the best AFD writer in my office. I will firmly admit that. But I ask some of the folks that are really good AFD writers in our office, could you come up with a list of tips and tricks? And they always tell me, well, I just write what I would want to read. So yes, we're meteorologists, and a lot of times we can think about, well, what would be useful to me to find out that I could read? What would make you want to read the AFD that you don't get somewhere else? That might help you right away as a background tip and trick. And of course, you're going to have your own style. Don't be stuffy with your writing. Don't just throw out numbers and numbers and numbers. Yes, we want to use probabilities, but we want to couch those probabilities and frame them around important thresholds or different outcomes. So we can give, yes, there's a 30% probability of this outcome synoptically, or 70% probability of this outcome, for example. And we'll get into some of those examples here coming up. So we can go to the next slide. So what is a probabilistic AFD not? That's also important to think about, I believe. And it's not a summary of the forecast. A lot of times we have a tendency that we just go in and write the AFD, we look at the grids and say, yep, it's going to be highs in the 70s today, cooling to highs in the 40s by Friday or whatever it might be, and you kind of just walk through it. That's really not what the probabilistic AFD is all about, because again, that is already the point and click. That is already the official deterministic forecast. It's out there. So it's also not a description of model simulation. So the GFS says this is going to happen, and the NAM says this is going to happen, because again, we want to add our expertise and our intelligence and share that knowledge. That's really what we're trying to get at with the AFD, is not summarizing the forecast, repeating the forecast that we've already created in a deterministic point and click. We've already created in weather story graphics and things like this. It's a value added product. We also don't want to just throw out a bunch of statements without reasoning. So Tommy mentioned earlier talking about, okay, we have some pet peeves with the AFD and we joke about that, but just saying, oh, I raised temperatures 10 degrees today, for example, above the NBM, and leaving it at that really doesn't do a lot. But if you give your reasoning, then that helps the user to understand, the broadcast meteorologist, for example, that go, oh, yeah, that's why we need to shift our forecast warmer today. Obviously, not just numerous numbers and probabilities, but we do want to use the probabilities. And ultimately, think about the AFD as just being an expert communication vehicle, one that you can't replace it by being automated. Go ahead to the next slide. So again, think about this as Tommy talked about earlier. As you're writing your AFD, think about it following your forecast process and really sharing your reasoning. One thing that I really find myself enjoying when I'm on the grid desk that writes the AFD in my office is being able to kind of explain my reasoning and almost sort of ponder other potential outcomes. And that's why the AFD kind of becomes a mini blog, if you'd like to think of it that way, or a mini thesis, not to use a scary word, right? But the reason we say thesis is because you need to explain the why. So yeah, it's going to be a beautiful day today, but why? Well, there's, high pressure aloft and all this good stuff, right? Again, because that builds trust. That's why we want to share the why. So whenever you say something in your AFD, think about explaining the why. But then once you're kind of done with that process, you've sort of laid out your deterministic forecast, right? All along the way, play your own devil's advocate. Think about what the other possibilities are and think about them aloud or in written word, right? Write them in the AFD, play devil's advocate, think about failure modes. Because again, we talk about the deterministic outcome, the most likely outcome. Yeah, it's important to mention. And as Tommy said, sometimes it might be 90, 95% confidence in that most likely outcome. but a lot of times, especially at longer lead times, that's not the case. So we think about reasonable worst case, reasonable best case, which might mean, from an impact standpoint, the difference between a washout on Memorial Day Monday with heavy rain, or it might mean dry, sunny weather on Memorial Day as an extreme. We need to consider that PDF of potential outcomes and describe them within our AFDs. That's where we really get that value-added information. So as we go forward here, some other tips and tricks that we've learned and that I've seen observed that others that, again, are better at writing AFDs than I am have done is start writing your AFD early. So historically, especially when I was coming up through the Weather Service and learning to write AFDs, you waited for the 12Z Euro, right? That was when I could finally write my AFD because I knew what the answer key was. There's no need for that because, again, if we go back to our general guidance that we just talked about, we aren't describing the 12Z European model in our AFD. We're describing our expert knowledge and what we expect to happen. So we don't need to wait for the latest models. Plus, a lot of what we're basing this forecast on, or our forecast discussion, especially at longer lead times, is the national blend of models, right? And the probabilities that come from the national blend of models, not just its deterministic output. And guess what? That's available really early by like 1Z and 14Z or something along those lines. We have the NBM for the extended. So the best practice for the folks that really like writing the AFD and that don't view it as just a chore at the end of the shift, they start writing it early. And you can use a work file within AWIPS to do this. And several folks in my office do this with great success. Something else that you can do, and I did this a few weeks ago because I was having trouble sort of concentrating, sitting in front of AWIPS, figuring out what do I want to write for my AFD. I actually went to my PC, I wrote the AFD in Word or in a Google document, and then you can use Iris and use that LLL product that'll send it over to AWIPS. So again, not remotely, I'm doing it at the WFO, which is the purpose here, but I could write it in Microsoft Word. It sort of changed my mind. And plus, a lot of the Ensemble tools that we use, right? A lot of the probabilistic tools are on the PC anyway. They were right in front of me. It just kind of helped clear my mind. Whatever you can do to kind of help yourself write better, more easily, are little tips and tricks that you can use. And again, all throughout the way, make sure you're sharing your thoughts on, potential future headlines, not just what we've issued already, but maybe other headlines, changes that you could see maybe happening down the road. Again, play devil's advocate. So don't just describe your current forecast, but sort of pontificate, if you will, what might be future forecast changes and really, those challenges that you're having. And then we have internal conversations in our office all the time, right? About what might happen or might not happen. Does that information ever really make it out? The AFD is a great, great, great vehicle to have that information, make it out to the world and share it in a format that, again, builds trust with us all along the way. Okay. So now we're going to step through some AFDs, but I think, a lot of times it's important to look back before we look forward. And so yesterday, I happened to be on the midnight shift, and so I wrote the AFD on the right-hand side is my long-term AFD from Tuesday morning. But I went back 35 years ago to the day to look at the state forecast discussion that covered all of North Dakota, and that is on the left by longtime lead forecaster Larry Manthe from my office. So it's interesting. You can see definitely a difference in length, right? It's not all about, how long the AFDs necessarily are, but in some ways, there's some similarities where they were talking about a flash flood warning actually in the state forecast discussion from 1987, and they were describing what was going to go on. They were trying to build that trust. And then the other similarity between these two things, as we all know in the Northern Plains, especially in North Dakota, it rains on Memorial Day weekend. That is not really a kickoff to summer weather, so that is another similarity 35 years apart. But on the right-hand side, you see my AFD long-term from yesterday morning. And, we try and use a lot of probabilistic kind of stuff. And we're going to step through this the next couple of minutes and sort of mirror the tools that I use and sort of break this down, starting with sort of the big picture and the statistics on the next slide. So another point, I guess, to start with is that you noticed I mentioned key messages in the long-term forecast. That's how I started my paragraph. It doesn't have to necessarily say key messages. It could be highlights or, you can outline your impacts, as Tommy mentioned earlier, but a plain language sort of bottom line up front thing is important. That's how I started my AFD yesterday. That's how I usually do, and Tommy does as well. And in the future, this might actually be in a bullet format. There's a potential Central Region initiative, and Bruce kind of alluded to some of that earlier, and some of the offices out there, I know the Kansas ones in particular, are already doing this. Really a nice bottom line up front really gets you to that point. Here's the key messages. So always think about that to sort of start off your AFD sections, whether it's short and long-term or a full discussion singular format. So after we do that, then we'll break down into sort of the patterns and the statistics. So again, sort of mirroring the forecast process, as Tommy was saying before. So what do I do with my forecast process for the long term? Well, I start with the NBM. I love the 1D viewer. What's the spread in the temperatures? What do the clusters show the mean pattern is going to be? And then what is the differences in those outcomes? So here I started by looking at those things and melded that into my AFD. So I really started talking about the pattern, middle and upper level ridging. So again, building that trust, describing the pattern that eventually there's going to be a trough. But then pointing out that, yeah, the spread in the NBM temperatures or the global ensemble temperatures is small, describing it less than 5 degrees. So we're really confident in these temperatures. So that's a good key point. Although you'll notice right at the end there, and again, my AFD is not perfect. We'll couch that, and we're going to have you judge my AFD here coming up in a few minutes, by the way. But you know, I mentioned Friday, lower 80s, depending on cloud trends, because there is a little more spread there. That's like the third box and whisker plot or something there. And then we see the gradual cooling beyond that. And again, I explain why as southwesterly flow aloft develops. So from there, then with the next section of my long-term AFD, as we go to the next slide, you know, I focused on the impact. As Tommy was saying, impact is really the important part, right? That's what folks especially want to know. So again, I started to describe that, yeah, precipitation chances start increasing as we go to that southwest flow aloft and shortwave troughs cross the area. Then, as my forecast process often follows, I go look at that European EFI. In this case, there really wasn't much shading, even for a long term. And some of the shades that you do see in the middle plot there of the EFI for my CWA yesterday actually were far to the south. They really weren't affecting my CWA. So that, combined with the machine learning process guidance from the Colorado State, really implied that, well, there's some severe weather risk. The impacts overall might not be as strong as you might suggest just from looking at the big trough, which is a good way to communicate to our broadcast media partners, to our emergency managers that, yeah, the weather's going to be active, but maybe not particularly high impact. And I couched that with the probability. So you notice in the AFD, I mentioned that the probability of severe weather from the machine learning guidance was 5% or less, marginal risk type equivalent. And then I went on to say, but given the pattern, yeah, it could be wet. And I couched that. I didn't just say, yeah, there's a high probability of heavy rain this weekend. I said, the probability of a half inch is 50%. And I based that right off of the NBM, which is on the right-hand side. So from there, if we go to the next slide, we kind of see that finally the spectrum of outcomes, right? Because again, we don't want to get into this deterministic mindset, even though already we were kind of framing things within probabilities in the last couple of paragraphs. But really then I shift back to the clusters in this particular case and talk about the different outcomes. And I picked just 2 of the clusters to show on the slide here. But again, you'd consider all of them. And really there was differences in the difference from this really deep trough on the left to maybe a shallower, more faster, lower amplitude kind of trough on the right. And so again, kind of framing this within, yeah, those are 2 different outcomes and we can't pick one or the other yet. Conveying that was important to me as I wrote this. But you'll notice right at the end, and we're going to get into this, I believe, on the next slide as well, that I noted the European ensemble was kind of weighted most heavily with that first cluster on the left-hand side there, and of all of them, and eventually it did close off, even though it doesn't show there. And I kind of shared a little bit of in-house expertise or things that we've noticed. It's still okay to share those things that you've noticed. Again, you're not just describing the tools, you're really trying to get into the framework of what are we talking about in the office? What's your expertise in sharing that? In this case, it's that, you know, sometimes the Euro and its ensemble is a little too slow and too deep with upper level troughs. It's something we've noticed, again, several times over the last month. And historically, it's okay to mention those things. In fact, it's great. That's where you're adding your expertise, that insider valuable information that might then be very useful to whoever is reading the product. So again, leverage and share your expertise. If we go to the next slide, you know, I didn't commit to a particular outcome there when I mentioned that the European might be a little too deep with its trough. It's just a tendency we've noticed. I noted the tendency, but didn't commit to that. Be a scientist. Another unrelated example down at the bottom there from an older AFD that we had written here is that, you know, supporting our headline decision. Yeah, red flag conditions. And noted that, yeah, even the 0Z NAM in that particular case, yes, I mentioned a deterministic model, and we're going to talk about that here coming up. But I noted that from its PBL parameterization scheme. And I know that that's biased towards shallower mixing in most cases. So again, it's okay to be a scientist. It's good to be a scientist in these cases when you can build that knowledge in there, because all that does is increase my confidence in red flag conditions. And if I convey that in a right tone, and a lot of the AFD is indeed about tone, it builds that trust. And really, it helps educate our deep partners too, which is pretty cool. So another way that I very often think about the AFD is a way to educate a broadcast meteorologist, educate up-and-coming meteorologists as well. Sometimes it's educating the social media armchair meteorologists. And I know we all have them. We have them in our forecast area too, our forecast areas here up in North Dakota as well. And one thing that we found over time is that as we message things in the AFD and start talking about ensembles more and more, one of our most notorious social media armchair meteorologists that has a big following has shifted his thoughts and what he shares on his page more towards ensembles too. We've actually educated our users. So again, another baseline reason to put this time, this effort in the AFD and frame it in this probabilistic, scientifically based, trust kind of oriented outcome. Okay, so we'll revisit the AFD in full form that we just stepped through here. And in a second, we're going to ask you in a word cloud, what could I have done better? Based on all of the guidelines that we've shared so far, Tommy really set us up kind of talking through here are the key themes that we really want to convey to really make a probabilistic type of AFD. And I'm not going to say my AFD is perfect because it's not, especially on a midshift, right? So now based on all of that, yeah, we walked through the good things about this AFD, but we want to pose and ask, what for this long-term AFD could have been better? So if we go to the next slide, and you've thought about the AFD, so throw in what do you think could have been done better in this AFD? No doubt there are some things, and we'll try and ponder a few of them aloud here in a minute as well. Maybe while you're generating, so I see shorter slightly, yep. Yes, I write long AFDs, there is no doubt about it. And that's a great point, that as we go to the next, even as we move forward in a minute, we'll leave the word cloud open for just about another 20 seconds or so. Length is not the end be all to end all. If it's my writing style, and it is my writing style to write longer, that's fine. But if your writing style is shorter, there's nothing wrong with it. And a case can be made that yes, if I get more to the point sooner and really address the impacts more up front, that can definitely really help make it clear so that user might be able to go to it immediately and jump right on it. So I'm gonna put Tommy on the spot here for a second before we move on. Anything else to you, Tommy, that jumps out that maybe could have been better on that?
Sorry, Chauncy, I was having trouble unmuting myself. Yeah, I'd have to read through it again, to be honest with you. I think the length was the first thing that kind of step that really jumped out to me. I really like the idea of bullets for the key messages, or for laying out what those messaging opportunities are. I think, any way that we can make the AFD easier on the eyes, right, for our partners or the customers that are reading our AFD, I think that's really something that we can keep in mind. And I'd have to go back and read the AFD again, but to kind of break the AFD into those messaging opportunities, right, to really highlight what that messaging opportunity is that you're talking about, I think could be important as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And no, thanks for sharing, Tommy. I appreciate that. And thanks everyone for sharing. This is great stuff, and I totally agree. And again, I want to make that point up front that we're talking about all these concepts, but that doesn't mean that we need to write long AFDs by any sort of the imagination. And again, a lot of cases that might actually be detrimental to what we're trying to do, even if that's some of our writing styles, and that's okay too. So if we go to the next slide, and thanks again everyone for filling out the poll. Another thing that might be important is that, I outlined the different outcomes, but I could have given it actually a number. I could have actually given a probabilistic number to the deeper trough solution with higher impacts. And as some of you noted, I could have been more upfront about what those impacts might have actually been. Heavy rain, if this trough, if the outcome with the deep trough, and I could have, from the clusters, given that an actual percentage outcome. And that would have been another way that we might have been able to actually improve it. So another actual point that I want to make, though, and as we're kind of going to go forward here in a minute, we'll talk about some do's and don'ts, the deterministic models. And I mentioned in one of the examples earlier about the 0Z NAM, and I mentioned the deterministic model. Ordinarily, we do not want to do that, as Tommy kind of mentioned earlier, because we want to think probabilistically, think about outcomes. But occasionally, it might be important to rely on or mention a deterministic model And one of those times might be when we're really trying to frame the real envelope of solutions. So again, when you have the armchair meteorologists or maybe some of your partners, broadcast meteorologists and others, really focusing on, say, that deterministic GFS that's generating the giant blizzard for us 5 days from now, right? That might be a case where in the AFD, it's important to point out that, yeah, we see the GFS. It's got that deep low, the big blizzard, right? But actually give it a probability of occurring from the whole ensemble spectrum. It can really help to kind of couch folks and, again, shift the message. That might be one place where we would actually mention a deterministic model specifically within our AFD. And if we go to the next slide, Tommy and I have kind of come up with an idea of maybe what some deterministic versus ensemble do's and don'ts might be. Maybe do mention them when you're mentioning, again, pointing out specific, how they relate to the full ensemble spread. But the other thing that's mentioned there is, yeah, use them to identify forcing mechanisms, because we, as Tommy stated earlier, we do want to build that trust by describing the forcing mechanisms and how they relate to the predictability horizon. So mesoscale forcing, shorter predictability horizon, for example. Although you might not to explicitly need to say GFS or EC or NAM, you can mention the forcing mechanism. On the flip side, we don't want to talk about, yep, the NAM is the most right, or the GFS is the model of the day. We don't want to do that sort of thing, or don't use them to just describe the forecast. So the GFS says a trough and a ridge and all that sort of stuff, right? That's not what we're trying to get at. On the other side, we do want to use the ensemble models to, again, describe outcomes, describe probabilities, and do use them as your reasoning for any statements you make about the forecast or anticipated impacts. And Tommy said earlier, the NBM is a teenager. As it grows and grows, the impacts that come right out of the calibrated NBM are only going to grow. Blizzard probabilities, for example, might be something that eventually we're going to get right out of the NBM. We can reference them. That counts as using an ensemble model. So some common pitfalls of non-probabilistic AFDs. So things that we've noticed over time is just saying something will happen unequivocally, especially in the long term. Are you really 100% certain that that is going to be the case? Sometimes it's better to frame these things as most likely, and then again, consider the other outcomes and use actual numbers to say something. 70% chance of heavy rain with these thunderstorms, for example. Don't use those words of estimated probability or WEPs. Use the numbers. We don't want to summarize model simulation. It's a common pitfall. I fall into that trap too. You saw my long AFD before. Sometimes my long AFDs are because I'm just summarizing model simulations and not getting to the upfront point, that value-added information. Being too deterministic, simply summarizing GFE grids is another pitfall that we can fall into that we want to avoid as we sort of frame this moving into this direction of a probabilistic style AFD and then not explaining the why. We do want to explain the why because, again, that builds trust. So I have a couple examples down there that would be sort of pitfalls of non-probabilistic AFDs, not saying that they are bad statements to make, just that they could be improved if we add a little bit more to them to think, again, in terms of outcomes, to think in terms of what the social science says, that we should actually frame the probability and state what the probability of an inch of snow is, or say why we're raising temperatures over the NBM today. So again, our other partners know why. The broadcast meteorologists that are creating their own forecasts know why. So again, if we go to the next slide, yeah, we throw the red X on there, things that we wouldn't necessarily want to do. So to kind of bring us home, we're going to step through a couple other examples and just kind of point out good key parts of this. Again, this is another AFD that I wrote as an example a month or so ago. Yeah, it's longer, on the longer side, although again, this was kind of the meat of the main AFD, and we start with that key message. But the things to also pick up on here is that this very process driven. So again, how the process in my mind, the forecast process, how I'm stepping through the clusters, stepping through the NBM data, and really then kind of focusing on that and relating it to outcomes and the eventual impacts while still providing my insider thoughts. So some key points that I pick out there, yep, 2 primary outcomes, then describe what they are. And then point out that, yep, both scenarios remain possible. So don't sit on one or the other. And then we actually give the detailed probability. So the impact in this case was heavy snow. So what is the actual probability of 6 inches of snow? We can get that right from the NBM, 30 to 40%. And then explain maybe what would lead to an even worst case scenario, stronger downstream ridging, something that can be watched in the future. And then we say, yeah, we encourage a heightened awareness of potential. So not only do we relate to impacts, but we talk about what folks can do. Check back with the forecast, right? And then lastly, that insider thoughts part of that, we're sort of stepping through and saying, yeah, the large scale pattern preceding this, it fits the conceptual model of what we expect for big events in our area, what again might tilt the odds towards a higher impact event. So we're going to step through this slightly again, I believe, coming up on a couple of slides. So if we go to the next one. So again, it follows my process. So on the left-hand side is that part of that AFD, that long-term AFD, talking about the two primary outcomes. And the point here that I want to make is there are 4 clusters, right? That doesn't mean we need to be, again, stuffy in our writing and just describe cluster 1 says this, cluster 2 says that, 3 and 4 that. No, we can actually break those down into 2 different impact-based outcomes. One's really deep, slow, close, low, clusters 2 and 4, and then clusters 1 and 3 kind of match the less amplified, less high impact type of scenario. So we broke that down into 2 different outcomes. Other times, yeah, there might be 3 or 4 different outcomes that you need to identify, whatever it might be. And it's going to be different as you are looking at shorter term convective kind of things as well. So if we go to the next slide, again, the probabilities that we voided the words of estimated probability. Instead, we pulled up the NDM 4.1 snow probs, which we know are pretty good, and in this case verified pretty well. And we actually framed that. What is the chance of 6 inches of snow? 30 to 40% range. One thing that we maybe could have added is that, just so folks know, this is really high probability for this type of time range. We're talking like almost 200 hours in advance from the forecast for this. That might be that insider knowledge that we could have added here to improve things even a little bit more. On the next slide, again, we're sort of describing what would maybe make things come to fruition. So about building that trust. What would happen to be the probability of the higher end impact event happening? Well, it would be based on stronger downstream ridging. Again, building that trust, helping to explain our process, what we're viewing, but almost also helping to educate some of our users for this, especially the higher end users, for what they can look at and use in the future to monitor rather. And again, as I mentioned earlier, some of our users in the AFD, right, they don't understand all of these things. Obviously, it's technical, and as the AFD directive says, it can be semi-technical. But just by them reading it, even if they don't fully understand it, they're going to gauge that, yeah, these meteorologists know what they're talking about. And again, that's something that we hear from different users that we speak to in our part of the world, and yes, including my brother. So if we go to the next slide, again, emphasizing impacts, the conceptual model, sharing that local knowledge. We broke this down already. We kind of talked about it. And the bottom part of this is probably the part that I want to focus on the most. And again, it's where we related in this sample AFD, the large scale pattern to a conceptual model of like what fits, strong northern plains winter storms, and comparing it to, yeah, the rest of the winter, it was different. We had split flow. We had different things going on. This is based on local research, and we shared it in an AFD. And then again, reiterated that the details are matter, and it's just not definitively known yet. So again, emphasizing the uncertainty based on an outcome-based type of process. So if we go forward to the next slide, the same principles that we just talked about, they apply in the short term. Obviously, it's going to be a little different in the short term. You're going to have observational data to also use, but in some ways, you're going to continue doing the same thing. So you're going to emphasize impacts, which is what's going on in this particular AFD here, starting with, again, the key forecast, previous thinking forecast is reasonable, not seeing much change. Sharing in-house thoughts on your messaging changes, which I believe is sort of towards the bottom of this one. This is not going to be a blizzard warning because of this. You're focusing on the short-term AFDs, more on observational trends, and again, what they mean and what their impacts are, and especially as we get in the short term, and that's the great part of this example in particular, is explaining the forcing mechanisms, and again, their impacts, what it means to the forecast. In this case, from this sample, it was based on, yeah, we're looking at forecast mesoscale type forcing, frontogenesis, and yeah, that means to a different type of predictability horizon, and then eventually the synoptic type forecast forcing rather will drive the snow. And again, so different sort of predictability horizons, different impacts, different uncertainties in the forecast where the snow bands will set up. If we go to the next slide, we'll see an example of, emphasizing these things for a convective scenario. And again, the key points from this sample would be that, we're using observations to support NWP expectations. We're relying on the RAOBs to build a conceptual model. We're establishing this really strong buoyancy in the northern plains. That's kind of the step through process that's going here. Yeah, it's on the long side. Again, writing style can be shorter, it can be longer. Sometimes bottom line up front bullet style will help improve that, as we talked about earlier. But again, we're sharing in-house expertise of PBL schemes. What does this mean? And then pondering eventually that, because of all of these things, especially the flow aloft in this particular case, the event could be a little restrained early on. So again, differences short-term versus long-term. You have more observational data, use that in the short term, then describe what your process is and what you think might happen. If we go to the next slide, we'll see sort of more of a focus on impacts and sort of downscaling the SPC moderate risk that was in place for this particular event. And you'll notice that we're consistent with SPC in this case. We're describing the moderate risk, but we're not just using the moderate risk to make our AFD be lots and lots of damaging winds coming later today. There are actually subtleties. As we know, SPC focuses on a slightly bigger picture. They are the convective experts, but we can downscale that as we do in the mesoscale process, but we can do that even within the next 1 or 2 days. Really, in this case, we expressed caution in following the CAMs verbatim. Again, knowledge that folks can use that are reading the AFD, that are more power users perhaps, that are going to look at the convection allowing models, and providing our reasoning for why we want to have caution in using those CAMs. And in this case, we talked about competing factors to the scenario. So the timing and the location of upscale growth that was going to drive the winds would be more difficult. And we pointed out that the CAMs have a notoriously hard time with that. So we didn't downplay the moderate risk explicitly and say, yeah, we don't think this is going to happen, but we advise caution in applying it and following it too specifically, because the moderate risk in this case went from our CWA all the way over to Duluth. So again, nuances, downscaled things that we can do. Another convective example, if we go to the next slide, or maybe first, here's another way that I could have improved this, and I could have shortened it, right? I said all of that, really I could have used this paragraph instead, and I could have used the actually say 70% of the CAMs say this, 30% say this, and then I could still give my reasoning and then sort of imply back to the impact. So really a lot of what I said in the last AFD, not saying that was a bad example, it's a good example, but a shorter AFD can be good too, right? It doesn't have to be long AFDs. Length, however, should depend on the situation. We do want to describe all of the things that we want to, outcome-based sharing our knowledge. So another way that we can look at this is another AFD example. And then, this explains how we created the POP forecast and why we did. So in this case, we kind of followed the CAMs, but really took a broad brushed approach because there was just kind of a scattered nature to things. And then the bottom part of this AFD, you'll notice where we really harness probabilities both from the href, so the localized probability match mean, and then the NBM probabilities of QPF, kind of melded them together to point out that here's your probabilities of getting ½ inch of rain at any given location today. It's really only like 5% because of the scattered nature of the convection. But it's still, instead of me just saying that any QPF today will be light, no heavy rainfall, I point out that, yeah, if you get underneath the core of some of these storms that are going to be scattered, you could have heavy rain. But the chances of you getting under that core, it's only 5%. And I took that right from our calibrated guidance. So if we go forward to the next slide. So this is an SPC one from about a month ago that I think fits and hits on a lot of the modernized AFD discussion-based kind of topics while still sharing their scientific expertise. So this is very outcome-based, but it melds observations to expectations, again, tips and tricks and best practices that we would like for these sort of things. And yes, it even describes deterministic HER runs. So yes, occasionally, as we pointed out earlier, it is important to describe the deterministic model outcomes, but you do it within the confines of the greater ensemble, because again, in this case, we know lots and lots of people are looking at the HER and they, oh, that's the answer key. Well, no, here's the other possibilities, and here is why. And that's what makes this a particularly great discussion, is kind of melding the OBS to the ensemble spread of the href members and really focusing sort of people away from just following that SPC or following that HER forecast as a result. And as a last example, I guess, think about probabilities on the next slide in terms of aviation discussions too. We said earlier in the talk that the AWC's AFD page gets hit a lot for the aviation discussions. We can apply these same concepts to our aviation discussions. We can actually apply a probability. So instead of saying, yeah, there could be fog affecting terminals, we can use the NBM, MBFR, and IFR probabilities to say it's a 10% probability. And then we can leverage our official POPs as necessary. So in this case, I mentioned there's a slight chance of showers this afternoon and evening. it's 20%. That was what was in our gridded forecast. It's consistent, and it again provides a number to those that might only be looking at the aviation part of that discussion, and we're still describing processes, the why. Yes, it's in a slightly more plain language format, daytime heating, for example, but we're explaining the why. So it hits on all the boxes. It's still short and actually applies to a more specialized user of the aviation side as well. So starting to kind of bring this all home, one of the conversations that may be out there is, should we have this short and long-term discussion? Should we have a single dot discussion, or doesn't it matter? It's something we've been talking about a little bit in our office in Bismarck this spring, and Tommy and I have visited about this too. And one of the forecasters here did a survey earlier this spring, a couple months ago, and you can see in a lot of ways it was kind of split. The single discussion and then sort of the folks that one way or the other were about the same, and then if only a smaller number actually wanted to do the short-term and the long-term discussion. We haven't made a change for this. It's something we're talking about, and something that, as we move forward in the modernized AFD format, if we start using more key messages up front, if we use more bullets, maybe we can switch to a single discussion, or maybe it still makes sense to leave it dot short, dot long, and use those same principles within it. Just things to think about, and we're going to ask you to think about them on the next slide. So curious, everyone that's out there, do you have a preference on this? Yourself, or maybe considering your partner's needs too, because obviously that's probably very important with all of this as well. And we'll give you a minute to sort of answer that question, get your thoughts on that, and then we'll turn it back over to Tommy to kind of bring us home. Looks like some results kind of starting to flow in a little bit. And it looks like, at least from the responses so far, folks like the separate short and long-term discussions as opposed to the singular discussion. And I admit too, I'm not sure which way I sort of fall on this, but definitely looks like the preference, at least in this poll, shifting towards those short and long-term discussions. And maybe that fits the forecast process that you're stepping through in your mind. Maybe it fits the desks that you have set up in your offices. Maybe that would be a great question to ask too, that we did not, huh, Tommy?
Yeah, exactly. That would be a great question to ask. It's, to me, kind of the question we need to ask is, how do the customers of the AFD, what do they want? How can they best get information? Can they best get information with a separate short and long discussion, or would they best get information just from one discussion section as well? Like, I know what I prefer to do, but maybe what I prefer to do isn't what is best for our customers, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a fantastic point. And that's, again, my office has started talking about this internally. We haven't made any changes, and that would be a vital next step probably for us as well, is to kind of find out. Like I said earlier, we have some really core users of the product from our partner side. Probably valuable to ask them what their thoughts are. So thanks everyone for filling out the poll. Interesting results for sure.
Yeah, and the other thought that comes to my mind is, maybe our operations should be set up for what our partners and customers need, right? So if they say just a one discussion section is better for them, maybe our operations then, instead of having like at our office, we have a short and a long-term forecaster, right? Which really merges into that philosophy of having a separate short and long section in the AFD. But maybe if a one discussion section is preferred by our customers and partners, to switch up our operations and the way that we delegate tasks might be important as well.
I was just going to say, that's a great point, Tommy. And my office is set up to one person does the grids and writes the discussion, even though right now we still do the short-term and the long-term sections. And I did just want to point out that, even if for some reason we decide to switch to a singular discussion, or your offices do in the future, we'd still want to cover all 7 days, right? And discuss all of the things that we just did. So in some ways, the content wouldn't change. It would be a formatting change. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Tommy.
All right. Thank you, Chauncy. I just kind of want to finish with just a quick thought about culture change. I always say, and I truly believe this, that culture change is really, really hard. Human nature is really to think deterministically. It's really, really hard to think probabilistically. And just to keep in mind that this isn't just going to be a switch that we flip and all of a sudden everybody across the region is writing AFDs perfectly. We've been at this at our offices for 3-4 years, and they're still not the perfect AFD. I still have not written the perfect AFD. So it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of practice. It's going to take a lot of self-awareness, a lot of baby steps, right? We have to realize that, look back on the last 2 months and see the progress you've made. You don't realize it at the time, but progress is always being made. And if you look back at 2-3 months in the past, I think it's really, really important to self-reflect on that progress that you made, because it makes you feel better that you're actually moving forward and in the right direction. Here at FGF, at our Grand Forks office, we have put in guidance within our SDM to try to get forecasters thinking about how they write their AFDs, and these are just some excerpts from our SDM. We put this in our SDM probably 4 or 5 years ago, actually. So a lot of what's in our SDM probably needs to be updated. Some things that are listed here within the bullets either need to be edited or updated, added or subtracted as we learn more about how people make decisions, what they need to make decisions, and things of that nature. But just kind of one of those tricks or ideas that you could use at your local office to get forecasters thinking about how they write their AFDs. And this could be something as well that, like Bruce and Chauncy had mentioned, that you could wait for that maybe directive supplement that may be coming, or at least the AFD writing guide is another idea that may be coming in the future. Other ideas that at our offices that have kind of helped with that culture change, the Ensemble tool Central Region site that Jim Siebeking is in charge of is great. It's kind of laid out in a way that we feel the forecast process should be undertaken, with identifying messaging opportunities. What are those tools to use to identify messaging opportunities, and then what are the tools to use to assess predictability for each messaging opportunity. When new forecasters or pathway students come into our office, we have them write AFDs right away. Maybe not for the public, but internal AFDs that we then talk about, provide comments within a Google Doc, and have them practice that every day. I think it's that practice and then the feedback that's really, really vital to help us improve. It's a local SUE team goal here to message probabilistically through the AFD, and to come up with ways or guidance to help our forecasters message probabilistically within the AFD. Daily showcases, examples are, I think, vital, right? We have to not just tell somebody, but we have to show somebody how to do it. So providing ideas of how I would write an AFD so somebody can see exactly what I'm talking about, I think is important. We do event reviews that tend to highlight the forecast process and how to message probabilistically. And then the SUE, local management, WCM, MIC, even the ESA, like they all have to be on board. We all have to be rowing kind of in that same direction. So just some ideas that we've tried here, things to think about and things to ponder. And I'll just kind of end this hour-plus talk. Sorry, we went a little bit longer than we wanted to. Kind of end this talk by just saying, like, we don't have all the answers. Things that we've talked about within this past hour, I challenge everybody on this call to really, think about maybe some areas where we're thinking about things kind of maybe poorly or in the wrong way, things that we could improve our ideas. We are totally open to ideas and suggestions on how to message probabilistically through the AFD. And we really hope that feedback comes back to us so that the next presentation that we give later this summer or this fall, we can kind of tailor this and build upon the ideas that we've kind of talked about here. So really this presentation was to start the discussion and to get us thinking about how we're writing our AFD. So I will end it there. Thank you again, Bruce and Central Region STI, for giving us this opportunity.